Okay, I can read that in the in the CC. So ready to go?
Yes, go
Awesome.
ahead.
I'll start. So thanks so much for having me here. Thank you so much for being really patient. I know this was meant to be the first one, so a huge thanks to those presenters who probably very unexpectedly and in a really surprising way had to present much earlier than expected. So thank you so much for your flexibility. This particular presentation is going to be all about taking a UDL approach to academic stress. I am Elizabeth Hitches. My pronouns are she, her, and I have short brown hair. And if you can't tell, I'm joining you from Australia. Next slide, please. Thanks so much. So I am a PhD candidate, and this is really drawing on the work that's happening during my PhD. But I believe that we can really take this as a concept in itself and hopefully start thinking about academic stress through a UDL lens already. Now, I feel really lucky to be a teacher of inclusive education, so I get to talk about inclusion and UDL a lot. I'm also a member of CAST National Faculty, so it's really great to see Sam and Luis there, and that all came about because of that connection with Sam. So huge thanks there. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, this is all about academic stress. I'm going to make some links to my current doctoral research, taking that academic stress through a UDL lens, and then of course, leave us with some takeaways that we can start thinking about. Next slide, please. Okay, so let's start with what is academic stress? Next slide. Okay, so thinking about what stress is, this is something that's experienced when we might come across a particular demand or challenge or what's called a stressor. And two people could come across the same sort of demand. So it could be something like an exam, but they may experience stress in very different ways. And that's all because we weigh up our experience and we think, do I have the resources to meet this demand? Do I have the ability to cope with that? Is this something that's going to help me or harm me? So, is this a threat or is this a challenge? So, I might be a student ready to face an exam. I've had plenty of time to study and I feel really confident and ready to go. That stress experience is not something that's detrimental to me. But if instead I have had many experiences with inaccessible exam formats, or perhaps I've been really sick lately and I know I'm going into that exam not at my peak performance, that could be a very different stress experience. Next slide, please. So, when we take this stress and we think about stress specifically in that education context, that's something called academic stress. And this can be in relation to a whole variety of things in that educational experience. So, things like students' own learning, their experience of their workload, also things like assessment and achievement, which are quite obvious ones. But even things like their academic expectations. So, what do they expect of themselves? Perhaps also there's pressure from others and expectations for achievement, but it can also be their self perceptions. So, how do they see themselves as a learner? That can impact that stress as well. And for anyone who's working in maybe an elementary or primary school context, this can even look like being worried that you're going to forget different activities and maybe worry about that in front of your peers. And then as we move through things like high school and into university, it's also about managing your study and managing that experience alongside things like work or alongside family responsibilities. And then, of course, with that transition into university or college, managing that navigation of this whole new life and this whole new system of working can be a source of stress as well. Next slide, please. Thank you. So, why are we even talking about stress? Why is this an important factor to consider in that learning experience? Next slide. Well, if we think about high stress, really high levels of stress or ongoing levels of stress, if we think about what's happening in that secondary or higher education context, there can actually be some really negative impacts just from stress in and of itself. So things like impacts to students' physical health, and this is for any student. And if we actually think about students who might have a chronic health condition already, so perhaps something like an autoimmune condition, that stress can actually be quite dangerous. It can actually exacerbate conditions that are already there. We also have some difficulties around mental health. Stress can be a precursor to a number of different mental health challenges, can also impact students' quality of life. And what we may not always realize, we're thinking about how barriers to learning impact on learning and achievement, but stress all by itself can actually impact students' learning capacity and their performance as well. So, high stress, not something that we really want to be having in that educational environment. Next slide, please. So, just an important note before we move on, some stress can be beneficial, that kind of stress that motivates you, or you think, I've got this thing due, I feel stressed about this, and it pushes you forward and makes you strive. That can be a beneficial level of stress. And if a student believes they're benefiting from stress, that can also have a positive impact as well. But that's not the kind of stress we're talking about here. We're actually talking about the high level of stress and that more negative ongoing stress. Next slide, please. So, why is this something we really need to consider? Well, it's actually an ongoing and even increasing challenge. So, before the pandemic, if we looked all across the world, across secondary education contexts and higher education contexts, we knew that students were experiencing a really high level of stress. And some research is showing that that was a level of stress that was even higher than the general population. Now, we can probably all see it in our own educational contexts, but things have not seemed to improve since that pandemic. There have been so many aspects that have become more stressful, and there are also some reports of students perhaps having some decreased capabilities of managing that level of stress. And I know that's definitely the case here in Australia. We've got a rental crisis happening, so many challenges financially. So, what students are experiencing just seems to get a bit tougher and tougher. Next slide, please. Okay, so now I want to focus in specifically on students who might have accessibility requirements or disability. So, in a higher education space, I'm thinking about those students who would be eligible for accessibility support or disability support, whether that's a student with a chronic health condition, a learning difficulty, a student who identifies as having a disability, or even it can be a carer of somebody with a disability. Next slide, please. So, some research with some colleagues of mine here in Australia was looking at student stress levels and comparing students who had accessibility requirements or disability with those without. And what we found, which probably isn't very surprising, is that students who said they had an accessibility requirement or disability had higher stress than their peers. But what really surprised us is that when we looked at those students who had sought academic accommodations and then compared them to students who hadn't, there actually wasn't a statistically significant difference in that stress. So when we did that quantitative analysis, these two groups were showing up as statistically the same, which is not what we'd expect. We'd expect perhaps there'd be reduced stress because there are accommodations taking place. Now, why this is really interesting is because the group who doesn't typically seek support, they're often missed in research because research studies will go to accessibility or disability services and recruit from there, or they'll ask specifically for students with a disability. And if students are not comfortable disclosing to their university or not comfortable disclosing to others, they can actually be a population that gets missed in our research. So we know very little about that group, but it's really interesting that their stress levels seem to be on par with those who are receiving accommodations. Next slide, please. So, if we think about where these stresses might be coming from for these students, we can see that there are a number of barriers in our learning environments currently. So, it might be things like barriers to learning, barriers to actually accessing classes or participating in that class in a really inclusive and equitable way, or achieving their full potential. And the real caveat here is that this is within the current structures and processes of our higher education institutions. So the barriers there can place these undue demands and challenges in students' way. And if we think about the fact that insufficient academic accommodation can be a source of stress, so if you need support and you're not receiving that, that can be stressful. But we also know the process to actually seek that support, to get it organised and implemented, and to really receive those accommodations on an ongoing basis across various different classes. That can be a really emotional journey. It can be a financially challenging journey, but it can also be a really stressful journey. So, whichever avenue students go, there are numerous stresses along the way. Next slide, please. Thank you. Okay, so this is where we think about what do we do about this? How can we perhaps prevent this high level of stress from happening or somehow intervene in this stress? And so the very start of my research was to do a look across the world globally, what's happening in the last 10 years in that higher education space. Now, disappointingly, but possibly somewhat not surprisingly, there wasn't a lot going on. It seemed that where those interventions were really focusing on academic stress, these were being trialled with students with mental health challenges. So it wasn't looking at reducing stress for students who might have maybe a physical or a sensory disability, or who might have chronic health challenges or be a carer for an individual with a disability. So what this really speaks to then is that the interventions currently available, there's a really big question mark over whether these are actually going to be accessible and inclusive for a really diverse cohort of students. If we're only testing them out on a particular group of students, students with mental health challenges, how do we know what's actually effective for this broad diversity of students? Can they access the intervention? Are there options for students who might be hard of hearing or who might have low vision? Are there options for students who may be in a vulnerable health circumstance and may not be able to be in a group situation on campus to receive some sort of stress intervention? A lot of unknowns, but that is ground to really start working on this research and to improve this. Next slide, please. So, what can we do? And this is where my colleagues and I have posed what would academic stress actually look like if we were doing something proactively to reduce those barriers? What would actually happen? So, if academic stress has numerous different challenges and numerous different negative impacts, could reducing that stress in a really proactive way actually have various positive impacts? Next slide, please. Okay, so this is where a UDL approach might be a natural fit. We're already thinking about minimizing threats and distractions. We can think about this in terms of unnecessary stresses. What are those unnecessary barriers that are leading to stress that are getting in the way of learning? We can also think about facilitating personal coping skills. What can we do to actually support students if they start to experience that high level of stress? How can we support those beliefs that optimize motivation? How can we reduce all of those barriers that might be in that learning experience? Next slide, please. So as I've mentioned, this research, it started out with that global look across the literature. It's also had a look at what students are telling us about their academic stress, viewing that through a UDL lens, and then going on to co-design a way forward, again through a UDL lens. Do you mind skipping 2 slides, please? Thanks so much, that's perfect. Oh, actually back one, perfect. Okay, so what is actually contributing to student stress? If we take that UDL approach, these are 2 examples that students are telling us. We have a student here who's telling us that their class attendance and concentration are a really key point of stress for them. They're phrasing it that it's their chronic health condition. From a UDL lens, we can think, what can we do about class attendance to remove that barrier? How can we open up options? If a student is having challenges with concentration, perhaps it's pain, perhaps it's other symptoms going on, what can we do to make sure that they have access to those learning resources the whole way through and can catch up in those moments that are missed? Next slide, please. Okay, and what I find really interesting here when we talk to accessibility and wellbeing staff, they're even mentioning things like assessment types that are not suitable for all learners or that might be providing barriers and asking, can we actually create adjustments to these. So we think about that action expression area. We have so many suggestions for how to open up different options for assessments. And staff themselves are saying there are barriers here that perhaps universal design and inclusive practices could solve. Next slide, please. So currently we're in the co-design phase. That's just about to kick off, thinking about how we can actually prevent or reduce that high stress and again, take that UDL lens to it. Next slide, please. So if you're interested perhaps in being part of that co-design phase or even being updated, feel free to reach out to me and I will drop those contact details into the chat. Next slide, please. But what can you take away from this? Final slide. Okay, so we can take away that academic stress is a really important factor within learning environments. We can't just think about accessibility, that's really important, but academic stress is also causing some challenges as well. Let's take a look at both. We also need to think that there are students in our educational environments, like students with accessibility requirements or disability, that are experiencing high levels of stress than their peers. So, what can we do? We know that the current approaches may not actually be inclusive and accessible for everybody, so we can't just rely on reactive measures. We need to be proactive. And what is a framework that we know that is really proactive for reducing barriers? Universal design for learning. So, can we UDL a way forward? And what really excites me, can we not just remove accessibility barriers and make it more inclusive, but could this actually have a positive impact on mental health? Fingers crossed. And that should be all from me. You can have access to these slides and you'll see some references as well. And just a big thanks to everybody who's been supporting this project, including Sam and Luis. So shout out to them as well. Thanks everyone for that very fast presentation.
Thank